Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 12 on the peoples of Middle-earth. And tonight we continue to watch it is the appendices, but it's more than just watching the appendices taking shape. The really fun thing about what we're seeing here, and in some ways I am a little bit disappointed that we didn't get this, in a sense, in its proper place, right? It would have been fun to see this, I think. You'll remember that Christopher put this off. He talked about that at the beginning of this book. That when he got to the end of the history of the Lord of the Rings, he did, he said, like, we'll talk about the appendices later, maybe, right? And then he's only now in the Peoples of Middle-earth coming back to it after having spent 2 volumes, sort of 2.5 volumes, depending on what you think about the second half of Sauron Defeated. Sauron Defeated is an odd book. I think one of the oddest of, as far as structurally speaking, in the history of Middle-earth. But in any case, the reason I would have loved it is because I really think it would have impacted my reading, our discussion of Morgoth's Ring and the War of the Jewels, because almost all of that stuff is stuff that comes after this. So, like, basically to get a clear, this provides a fascinating picture into where Tolkien was in his creative development right after finishing the Lord of the Rings. And of course, we saw the Silmarillion stuff that he turns to after that. Again, in War of the Jewels and Morgoth's Ring, and that's great, and that's really interesting. But this is the stuff that he did before going back to that, and in some ways, I feel like what is happening, like the big picture of what we can see happening, in this immediate post Lord of the Rings journey of his creative world, right? It's like, okay, so he decided in the middle of writing The Lord of the Rings that the Hobbit sequel was going to be fully integrated with his mythology. And the result is the marvelous story that grew, right, in The Lord of the Rings. And what he does immediately afterwards is, but like to a large extent, with many, like individual exceptions and things, he sort of, I don't know if this is quite the right way to say it, but he sort of subordinated. Okay, let me finish my sentence and then qualify it. It's a bad habit of mine to want to qualify a thing that I'm saying and to qualify it in the middle of it and then mess up the original statement, so it's totally impossible to follow my thought. Let me try that again. He wanted to publish the Silmarillion. He wanted to go back. He was deep in the work on the Silmarillion in 1937 after writing The Hobbit and thinking that he was going to get a chance to publish it. He grudgingly set the Silmarillion material aside, the work that he was doing, which he thought was prep for publication in 1937. He grudgingly set that aside to go back to the Hobbit sequel. But then, of course, the Hobbit sequel grows delightfully and becomes the Lord of the Rings, and he spends the next 7 or 8 years writing The Lord of the Rings, with some interruptions, especially, of course, and especially relevant to the stuff we're going to talk about tonight, with the kind of eruption of the Numenor story in the latter part of The Lord of the Rings, which delayed The Lord of the Rings, of course. Anyway, so there are some exceptions, like there are some things that kind of interrupt the process, but by and large, he's kind of locked in on The Lord of the Rings. Certainly, he's not returning to the work of prepping the Silmarillion in the serious way he was doing in 1937 while he's working on The Lord of the Rings, right? But then he finishes The Lord of the Rings, and as soon as he does, he has to take stock, right? He had what he thought at the time in 1937 might be the published Silmarillion, the publishable Silmarillion, but now The Lord of the Rings has happened. Right now, and as a result of the integration of the Hobbit sequel, and which has grown and developed in all these wonderful ways, and his mythology, right, and the Legendarium, now it's done things right? Not only to the Lord of the Rings, but of course to the Legendarium as well. And him kind of figuring that all out and taking stock of all of those things. That is one of the major things I see happening here in the process of this work, which it's perfectly just obvious. I mean, it's obviously perfectly just to call this the development of the appendices. But this is the thing that I was particularly struck by when reading through the Tale of Years chapter. I feel that we really learn a lot in that chapter, even though it may seem really fiddly, like all of these details about him changing the number of Numenorian kings and their exact dates and everything, and kind of fiddling around with that back and forth and writing 4 different very similar drafts of, the chronologies and all of these things. But anyway, he but again, despite the fact that in some ways it seems kind of superficial and fiddly, I found it really revealing, actually, in thinking about, in helping me to understand the trap that he was caught in at this stage, the trap that was the appendices. Far from the appendices being like the stimulus for this material, it seems to me that to at least as great an extent, the appendices was the weight that was dragging all of this down and squelching it, really. It's really tricky. But yes, David Michael, you're certainly right. We can't forget, and of course it's actually kind of easy to forget if you're just reading the history of Middle-earth, because Christopher doesn't spend much time talking about things like the Tuor story and the children of Húrin, right? And all of that stuff. He's doing all that stuff at the same time. So that was one of his impulses, right? To go back and to rewrite some of those, not to like totally redo all the, though he was working on a bunch of the Silmarillion stuff as well. But anyway, it's, so I'm excited to talk about the Tale of Years stuff and to see, this is what we're going to be focusing on today, is the Numenor stuff. And I've titled this session, The Tale of Numenor Attempts to Grow Up. It attempts to grow up because I think it's ultimately failing to grow up, which is quite sad, actually. And in some ways, I'm not ready to put it yet on the level of, there's still no question that, the new Tuor story is still number one on my list of unfinished things that I wish that Tolkien had been able to allow himself to spend more time and finish. That's still number one on my list. However, in a weird way, for the first time in my life, I'm now prepared to put the Tale of Years on that list. Or, to be more accurate, the Numenor story in general, actually. You could say the Akallabeth just as well, but again, it's not about that document. It's not about that version of the story. It's about the Numenor story as a whole. Anyway, I will. Yeah, and Everett, it is interesting. We can't get too far down this particular road, or we won't even start discussing the score of passages I would like to look at tonight. But anyway, Colin is referring to, Everett was referring to the sort of the mystifying failure of Tolkien to publish almost anything after The Lord of the Rings, even though he really wanted to. I've alluded to the fact that I've been rereading Tolkien's letters recently, and I am in the midst of those. I find it the most painful stretch of his letters. This period of time in the mid-60s. Not this period. We're later. I'm later in the letters than we are in his life as he's doing this stuff that we're reading about in Peoples of Middle-earth right now. But in those letters in the mid-60s, in which, like in every other letter, he's like complaining about having to spend time working on Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and how it's not going well, and how he like really, really wants to get time to work on the Silmarillion, and he can't do any more interviews because he needs to do this and he's got to get this done, and yet he's not getting it done, right? But I think, Everett, that one of the sort of hints at the situation can be seen in all of these different things that are kind of blowing up right now, right? There is a sense in which this is this is obviously not a full answer to the question, it's not a full way to sort of elaborate the subject, but one really, really simple thing to say, I think, is that the Lord of the Rings kind of, when it joined the mythology, it broke all the boundaries. And the result is just like this sort of chemical explosion, right? I mean, like, I don't know, Mentos and Coke or something, right? Like this just, this burst. And it just went everywhere. Both things went everywhere, right? The Lord of the Rings did get done, right? But yeah, see, that's the thing, Melgren. I used to think that it was mostly about fiddling, but it's not about fiddling. The problem with the Silmarillion wasn't that he didn't stop tweaking it. The problem was that it blew up. The whole thing blew up. And not just in the, like, I'm going to sit around and do lots of math about elven growth charts and stuff. Like, not just that kind of blowing up. But it's, again, there was an actual, I use the metaphor, which is an awkward metaphor in some ways, of a chemical change. Because, I mean, the thing is different now. It's not an addition, right? It's like when a chemical change has happened, the substance that's there is now fundamentally different than it was before. And the substance and the scope of the Silmarillion is never the same again once the Lord of the Rings comes in contact with it. And the whole idea of what it means to finish the Silmarillion, what it means to get the Silmarillion, like he talks in his letters as if he could just go back and finish up what he started in 1937, that process, as if he could do again in, 1950, 1960, any time in the late 50s through the 60s, as if he could just do what he had been doing. He had been getting the Silmarillion ready for publication. He thought it was just about done. And in a sense it was. You could argue that in a sense it was almost done. Like in that stage, it was almost done. It would have been an odd publication, as I've talked about, but still he was closer then. I think he was closer to finishing the Silmarillion in 1937 than he ever got again. And that's because the Silmarillion changed. It blew up. It blew up. It became fundamentally different. And he, the whole idea of but I think he was still, I think that he himself didn't fully perceive how it had grown and changed. But anyway, we'll come back into this. I should stop just kind of talking about it in general, and we'll get into specifics from the text, and I'll show you what I mean about, I think, as I say, tonight we're going to focus in on the Numenor story. And what I want to encourage you to think about as we discuss the Numenor story is to think about Numenor as an instance, right? The story of Numenor is a small part of the whole legendarium, right? I mean, both as far as like one chunk of the chronology, right? But even more so, think about the percentage of the narrative that he had written, right, of the legendarium, from the eldest days all the way up through the, I'm back, right, at the end of the Lord of the Rings. And think of what a small, we're looking at the fall of Numenor, the downfall of Anadune, right? Pretty much what we're looking at. So that short story compared to all of the other stuff that he'd written, right? And so story of Numenor is kind of a case study, right? It's a case study of what's happening in Tolkien's mind as he's sitting down to put just that into a place where it could be published. Because the Fall of Numenor was short enough to potentially just be an appendix, right? It could have been included, in theory, in The Lord of the Rings. If he, as he obviously did, want to provide more information, right? Anyway, yeah. Yeah. So, Everett, I think yours is a fascinating suggestion. He says, I don't understand his departure from his successful formula. Write about important events from the perspective of humble characters. Where's the story about Feanor's gardener's son? That's a great question. But see, Everett, that's one of the things I'm talking about, right? When I say he talked as if the work that needed to be done on the Silmarillion was just the work that he had been doing in 1937. I just need to go back to what I had in the form that I had it and polish it up. What you're suggesting, Everett, is him basically chucking out everything that he'd written, essentially. Like all of the actual text that he'd written. And not just that, but his entire approach to it, right? The annals, the Quenta, like the whole development of his plot summary genre, right? That he developed in the annals that he had been developing and all this other stuff. And just say, you know what? Let's tell those stories, but let's, through the eyes of like the Sam Gamgee of the First Age, right? That's it could theoretically have been done. It would have been hard. And I think it would have been an even more fundamental change than perhaps you thought. But see, here's the thing, Adam. I believe that it would be overwhelming for him to try that. But what he was actually trying to do was even more overwhelming in the end, I think. Anyway, I'm not necessarily trying to defend that particular approach. The point that I think, Everett's point that I think is very well taken, though, is just to go back and, rather than saying, okay, this is now a new thing, let's just embrace that and let it be a new thing. I think it actually would have been better if he'd done with the Silmarillion what he did with everything else. That is, go back and start it at the beginning again. He didn't do that. Not really. I mean, he did kind of go back and be like, let's do it again, this time with math, right? But yes, the Narn is like that. I agree. Yes, the Children of Húrin, right? What Christopher published as the Children of Húrin is very much like that. Like, that's the closest that he came to that, I think. If he had done that impulse, if he had just been like, okay, you know what? Forget the annals. Forget the Quenta. I'm just going to write it. I'm going to start again. I'm going to start again in a different mode. Then I think he'd have gotten along better than he did trying to revise it. But anyway, whatever. I'm getting off track now. Let us case study the story of Numenor as a case study, because I think we can see some really interesting things about the kind of tensions and conflicts in Tolkien's mind at this stage in his writing. But before we do, very brief sidebar. It is, of course, still the fall fundraising campaign for Signum University. And I want to thank everybody people have been making donations to support Signum, as you have for the last 13 years. And I am so grateful to everyone who has made donations. Thank you for helping us to share joy with people, to create spaces like this where people can participate in these discussions for free, to create places where people can dig even deeper. In our space program, in our graduate program, in our collaboratory and store with the premium content that we're able to create. There are so many different ways for people to find joy and to participate in a joyful community. And those two things, joyful community, are things that are really, really valuable right now in today's world. They've always been valuable, but they feel especially valuable right now. But in any case, so as I say, I'm very grateful to everybody. If you have not made a donation, I urge you to consider doing so. All donations to Signum University are tax deductible in America. And if you go to signumuniversity.org/donate, you will find our donation form in which you can make a one-time donation or you can set up a monthly donation. If you have a monthly donation, maybe you created a monthly donation years ago and you'd like to revisit that, maybe increase that monthly donation. You can do that by sending an email to donate@signumu.org, and we would be happy to help you with that. Thank you to everybody who has donated. It means so much to us. One thing I want to do to celebrate the campaign, as I always do, is to do a giveaway. It's kind of a way of, thanking people. But what I want to do this differently. Well, the same way that I did last night, but differently from how we did it last week. Because I know that many people cannot attend these sessions live. Because they're late at night and sometimes in the middle of the night, depending on where you live. So I know that there are many people who listen or watch after the fact. And I want to give them an opportunity to participate in the giveaway as well. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to do an asynchronous drawing for Mythgard Academy. So everybody who listens to this between now and a week from now, which is November 19th of 2025, I should probably mention. So if you are able to listen to this right away, I encourage you, send an email to donate@signumu.org. Make sure to give us your regular name and mention in the subject line Mythgard Academy so that we know which drawing you are entering. Just send an email with your name in it and Mythgard Academy in the subject, and we will enter you in the drawing at the beginning of class next week. I will draw from the list of people who have emailed, and we will give away a prize. As for the prize that we give away, I'd like to give away a space token today. So it'll be a space token for the Mythgard Academy. So anyway, I encourage you. Again, this is just, one other way of thanking everybody for their involvement in this. So donate@signumu.org is the place you can just send an email. If you're listening live, you can send an email right now. If you're listening live, you're very welcome to participate in this as well. But I just wanted to open that also to people who are listening outside the time. Anyway, let us get back into the text here. So first, we need to finish up Christopher Tolkien's confessional chapter, where he, in his discussion of the Akallabeth, is pulling back the curtain and confessing all of the things that he changed in the Akallabeth, which is just so fascinating. So just a few other things to notice about that. Starting off with a couple things relating to the frame and such. As we're getting towards the end of the Akallabeth here, he quotes the paragraph that begins, "The days are dark, and there is no hope for men." This is, as I recall, the speech between Amandil and Elendil. Christopher says, the text has, "There is no hope in men." And the reading in the Silmarillion appears to be a mere error, since there is no reason for the change. So here, this is not him confessing that he made an editorial shift. He's here just admitting a mistake. There is no hope for men. So he says, there is no hope in men, is what the text says. And he's like, yeah, there's no justification for that. What Amandil said to Elendil is, there is no hope for men. This, by the way, is particularly interesting. It's a particularly interesting typo, because it seems like tangentially related to the frame issue, right? The fact that this is that the story is being told by an elf to a human about the history of humanity, right? And so it's kind of substantive, therefore, whether you're saying there is no hope for men or no hope in men, because although it is really hard to imagine Amandil saying there is no hope in men to Elendil, or at least it's a very dark and despairing comment indeed, right? In that context. But it kind of becomes a little, well, not exactly comical, but it kind of becomes a little salty, right? If you imagine it instead in the mouth of, Pengaloth speaking to a human, right? Yes, it could mean men have no hope. Like there is no hope. Like the men as a whole contain no hope. Their hopeometer is all the way down on E, right? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. David Michael, I wasn't quite imagining Pengaloth saying men are weak to Alfwine, but like one can almost imagine such a thing. But in any case, what in fact Tolkien wrote apparently was there is no hope for men, which is obvious, right? That's a perfectly intuitive thing for Amandil to say to Elendil. But then, of course, Christopher goes on. In the speeches of Amandil and Elendil that follow, my father evidently intended a distinction between thou from father to son, and you from son to father. But his usage was not consistent. In the Silmarillion, I substituted you throughout. Christopher! Why is that his kryptonite? And here's the thing. This drives me crazy. Because he actually sees the difference. Yeah, it's kryptonite. Exactly. He actually sees the distinction, right? He notices the pattern. It's in many places he seems to not notice the pattern, right? But here, he notices the pattern. Yes, the father is using the informal thou to his son, and the son is using the formal you to his father. So, Christopher, do you think maybe when there's a shift from that, once that pattern is established, that a deviation from that, rather than just being some kind of accidental and inexplicable inconsistency on your father's part, maybe it's in fact extra significant? Right? That he was making that one of the characters was making a particular point. Because I bet you anything that at least one of the shifts, in fact, I bet you that the shift in question, that in the original draft, Amandil shifts at some point. He begins by addressing his son in the second person informal, as thou, right? With the affectionate informal that a father would use for a son. But I bet you, when he talks about what Elendil has to do and the calling that is upon Elendil, that he shifts to you. And that he addresses him formally, knowing that that's his way, that's Amandil's way of indicating to his son Elendil that his son Elendil is going to have to step up and become the leader. I don't think he sees himself as king yet because they're not at a king place right now, right? But it's this whole conversation is about like, I need to do what's right. I need to follow what I believe to be my calling, and you need to follow your own calling as well. And I bet you anything that when that happens, Amandil shifts from speaking to Elendil as thou, and he starts speaking to him as you. Speaking to him with the formal measure of respect that you would show to an elder and a leader. And for Christopher just to dismiss, again, this, I don't like complaining about Christopher, but it's just like, seriously, it is amazing to me how, we all have blind spots. This was Christopher's blind spot. We did. We did. Christopher addressed it. Yes, like he knows that it's, and he's admitting here that he sees the pattern. But then he just plasters it all over. He just like slathers on, the, spackle on top of the mosaic, right? And makes them all you throughout. Unbelievable. I can't believe how close he came here to seeing what's going on. But it just seems to be, like I said, it just seems to be a blind spot in Christopher's thinking. Like he knows the rules. And the problem that he has is when his dad seems to be breaking the rules. At which point his reaction to seeing his father break the rules. He knows how thou and you are supposed to be used, as he demonstrates in this paragraph. And when his father deviates from that, and we have all of a sudden, because I bet you anything, it's what happened, that Emondil starts referring to Elendil as you. For some reason, Christopher's like, oh, but that's against the rules. And so apparently my father was confused or whatever, or other people are going to get confused. So I'm going to forget about it. Yeah, he doesn't stop. He doesn't even seem to like be suspicious that there is a reason. That's why I call it a blind spot. I mean, it really seems to be a blind spot there. And this is the most, in its way, the most infuriating example. Because in other places, it's like it doesn't even occur to him. Here, like, it's right there. Christopher, you said it. Oh, man. Yeah. Anyway. Okay. I'm done with the second person. Moving on. Bygones. Let's instead talk about the lost frame. Elendil and his sons. So this is near the very end of the Akallabeth. The opening of this paragraph was altered in the Silmarillion to remove a reference to Ælfwine. And here ends the tale, Ælfwine, to speak of Elendil and his sons, who later founded kingdoms in Middle-earth. So where... The Akallabeth, so-called, right, the downfall of Numenor, the story of the downfallen one, there's like an intrinsic moral to that. So like it's hard to tell that story without any element of like moral applicability, right? I mean, it's a cautionary tale, no matter how you tell it, right? This little quotation from the segue into the end of the story, within the frame, right? How Pengaloth is framing the end of the story for Ælfwine really brings that home, doesn't it? An elf telling the story to a human and emphasizing both the message of hope of Elendil's arrival in Middle-earth and the continuity, like the exist. So like one of the messages, like basically it becomes so clear that there are the two. And again, it's not that this is not a perceptible thing anyway, but it makes so much more visceral, I think, the kind of two obvious take-homes for a reader like Ælfwine, or indeed like us, right? Take-home number one. There is a through line from Numenor to you, right? Numenor, the greatness, Numenor that is lost and that will never return, in a distant echo lives on in you because of Elendil, right? It may be lost. Numenor itself may be lost, but it hasn't been completely forgotten. And it still has a legacy living among humans. That's take-home number one. But take-home number two is, and so don't forget Numenor. Take heed of Numenor, lest you repeat that story again, right? And I love the way in which the frame kind of brings that home. So speaking of the frame, I'm so grateful. Thank you, Christopher, for giving us this. That is what the frame was saying in a long stretch here. But if thou wouldst know, Alfwine, ere thou goest, why it is that men of the seed of Earendel, or any such as thou, to whom some part, however small, of their blood is descended, should still venture upon the sea, seeking for that which cannot be found, this much I will say to thee. The summit of the Meneltarma, the pillar of heaven, in the midst of the land, had been a hallowed place, and even in the days of Sauron none had defiled it. Therefore among the exiles many believed that it was not drowned for ever, but rose again above the waves, a lonely island lost in the great waters, unless haply a mariner should come upon it. And some there were that after sought for it, because it was said among lore-masters that the far-sighted men of old could see from the Meneltarma a glimmer of the deathless land. I just love this. You may remember the paragraph from the published Akallabeth that he's alluding to here. The reference to the Meneltarma, right? And there's a bunch of and it is said by some, and and in after days, those kinds of things. That's kind of, it's familiar phrases like that Christopher replaced this with in the published Silmarillion. And yet they in the published text, those paragraphs still feel oddly detached. Like the story is over, and there's kind of a question of for who's being addressed, they feel a little bit oddly tacked on. They're still tacked on here in the original, but they're sensibly tacked on, right? They're tacked on because it is the speaker of the story bringing the story home to the personal experience. At the end of the story of the Akallabeth, Alfwine is learning something about himself. Pengaloth is showing him that his story, in part, might help to explain why Alfwine set out to sea in the first place. What sparked Alfwine's own sea longing that began his voyage, which ended unaccountably, unexpectedly, with him discovering the straight road and ending up in Tolerancia, learning the story from Pengaloth or whoever it was, right? Probably Pengaloth. So the move at the end of the frame here was to make this story personally relevant, the Akallabeth story, personally relevant to Alfwine, and therefore the whole story to kind of operate on a separate level, a level which again really we lose almost completely in the published text. Anyway, one last note on the frame. Here's again Christopher just making a note about a small thing that he changed. Thus in after days, the sentence, until it came to Tolerancia, the lonely isle. Remember, this is the paragraph in which it's talking about the lost road, right? The straight road. And again, in the published text, it says, until it, that is the ship, right, came to Tolerancia, the Lonely Isle, was a change in the Silmarillion from the original until it came to Eresia, where the Eldar, where are the Eldar immortal. Immediately following, where the Valar still dwell, and watch the unfolding of the story of the world, was an early change from the reading of A, where the Valar still dwell, but watch only and meddle no longer in the world abandoned to men. The thing I wanted to point out here is, and again, this we know from his own discussion of it back in War of the Jewels, that Christopher not only did not find the decision easy as to what to do about the frame, nor was he himself wholly satisfied with the choice that he made in after years, as we're seeing in this confessional chapter. So again, I'm not here just to, kick Christopher while he's down and say how horrible I think it was. But I would point out, in some ways, but at risk of kicking him while he's down, I will say this. I've said that I can understand that removing the frame was the simpler of the two choices. Neither is simple, but he had like a partial frame. Some of the elements of the Silmarillion have a frame. The Akallabeth has a frame. The downfall of Numenor has a frame. The new downfall. I'm just going to call it the Akallabeth, even though Tolkien didn't name it that, just because that's what we know it as. The Akallabeth has a frame. The Ainulindale has a frame. Parts of the Quenta have a frame, right? So there's a lot of it that has a frame, but not all of it had a frame. And so again, the fundamental choice that Christopher was faced with was either eliminate the frame from all of it, or write a frame himself for the rest of it that did not have a frame. And of those two things, the writing a frame himself for the unframed material seemed the more violent of the two options to him. And I can understand that rationale. What I think that this passage, and this is a really simple little passage, but it's one of multiple examples that we've seen when we've been looking at this over the course of this chapter. What it suggests to me is that removing the frame is far more complicated than it sounds. It's not just about lopping off a bit at the beginning and lopping off a bit at the end. It's not just about, removing the conversation tags, quoth Pengalod, right? Because, as he's pointed out, the elvish perspective from which the story is being narrated is baked in throughout. And Christopher is quite perceptive enough to see that, like this one. This is not a radical change that he makes, right? Look again at the two passages. In the published text, until it came to Tolerancia, the Lonely Isle. Changed from in what Tolkien wrote, until it came to Erisea, where are the Eldar immortal. Where are the Eldar immortal betrays the fact that this is a story told to a human, right? Anyway, as I say, I don't want to belabor it, but there's you can go back just over the passages we've looked at, and you can see this is a pattern, right? There's a subtle tweaking of things that you need to do in order to convey, in order to strip it of its elvish, I'm tempted to say bias, though that makes it sound like a bad thing, right? Perspective maybe is that's what you said in my subtitle. There are places where you can see it has an elvish bias, an elvish perspective. And he had to go through and systematically remove, which means he had to tweak this and shift this all over the place in the text in order to hide that. And there are further consequences. Not only did it involve him in, I suspect perhaps almost as much revision as adding a new frame to some other stories would have been. But in some ways, I think you could argue a more profound change. I bet you could fit the perspective. Like, I don't think he would have had to tweak in the same way had he been adding a frame. But in any case, yeah. Yes, Horatio, you were right. One of Christopher's premises was he wanted to write himself as little as possible. Again, the irony is he ends up going through and rewriting a bunch of his father's actual sentences in order to accomplish that, right? So the cost of not including several completely fabricated by Christopher paragraphs is in fact to having to go back and reorient and rewrite many of the things that his father himself wrote, which was also contrary to his editorial premise as well. Yeah. Anyway, okay. Last note about the frame. Here's where it was going to end. Again, thanks to Christopher for telling us this. After the conclusion of the Akallabeth in the Silmarillion, the following lines were omitted. And whether all these tales be feigned, or whether some at least be true, and by them the Valar still kept a light among men, a memory beyond the darkness of Middle-earth, thou knowest now, Alfwine, in thyself. Yet haply none shall believe thee. What an ending! He ended originally the Akallabeth with, yet haply none shall believe thee? Oh man, that is so cool. I love that. Yeah, exactly. Happily means maybe. It doesn't mean happily, right? Like, fortunately, he's not saying fortunately no one will believe you. Happily, like, it may hap that none shall believe thee. Yes, almost literally mayhap. Yes. Anyway, notice the odd admission at the beginning, whether all these tales be feigned, or whether some at least be true. The tales that Pengaloth just told, he's saying it might be that some of the stories I've told you aren't true. They might just be feigned. They might be made up. Or whether some at least be true. Maybe a few of the stories I've told you actually happened. Yeah, Eric, I agree. It implies that there's already some question that some have challenged the accuracy of the elves' account. Yes. It's possible that he's being a little bit sardonic there. Like, he's going to say, happily none shall believe thee. So is he kind of here anticipating the reaction? Not necessarily that he's going to get from Alfwine, but that Alfwine will get when he brings these stories back to humankind. Right? They're going to say that all these stories are feigned. Let them do so. Maybe some will admit that some of them might be true. But I think that in any case, like, no matter how people respond to these stories, by them the Valar will still be kept a light by them the Valar still keep a light among men, a memory beyond the darkness of Middle-earth. That's the point of the stories, and they will have that effect, whether or not they're accepted as true, or whether they're thought to be feigned. So I suspect that that's what he's getting at there. But it's just the way in which Penguin, frames that first sentence. Makes it sound like he's considering it an open question whether the stories he just told are true or false, which sounds like a really weird thing for Penguin to say. But I do think that the chief point is, what is the function of these tales? Why am I telling you these tales? Why is it good for you to bring these tales back with you to Earth, to, Middle Earth? Yes, they are themselves the vehicle for the Valar's light in the world. And I don't know about you, I could not help but think of, which one was it? Letter 5? That heartrending letter that he wrote in right before the Somme, on the death of, was it Gilson or Smith who died first? It was Gilson's death, wasn't it? I forget which. One of them was dead and the other one he was writing to, and I can't remember which one it was. But in any case, in that letter, that's the something has gone crack letter. But in that letter, he talks about a light. This idea of keeping a light among men, a memory beyond the darkness of Middle-earth, really resonates with what he was saying he felt to be their calling, the TCBS's calling, his calling. Anyway, so it's that echo is really fascinating to me here because, of course, Ælfwine is becoming the transmitter of these stories. Yeah, these tales are mankind's version of the sapling of the white tree, Eric. Yeah, I agree. Anyway, fascinating ending that I kind of wish we'd have gotten. But I'm going to stop complaining about that now. I'm going to try to go through these. They're sort of longish passages, but I'm going to go through them relatively quickly. This is the beginning of what I'm wanting to focus on. So this is still in the Akallabeth chapter. But this is like the kind of like post, there's like a post log, right? This little like concerning Muriel's story. Remember, this is Tar Muriel, the last queen of Numenor, who has to marry Ar-Pharazôn. And in the main text, in the draft of the text, it says that she's married by force, like she's compelled to marry her first cousin against her will. But there were these other drafts of things that he was writing, right? Watch what's happening here. Okay, it was Gilson. It was G.B. Smith that he was writing to, and Gilson died first. Thank you for I couldn't remember off the top of my head which was which there. Yeah, okay. He, Ar-Pharazôn, was a man of great beauty and strength stature, after the image of the first kings, and indeed in his youth was not unlike the Edain of old, in mind also, though he had strength of will rather than of wisdom, as after appeared, when he was corrupted by the counsels of his father and the acclaim of the people. In his earlier days he had a close friendship with Amandil, who was afterwards lord of Andúnie, and he had loved the people of the house of Valandil, with whom he had kinship, through Inzilbeth, his father's mother. With them he was often a guest. And there came Zimrahil, his cousin, that's Muriel, of course, daughter of Inziladun, who was later King Tar-Palantir. Elentir, the brother of Amandil, so this is the uncle of Elendil, who is going to get dropped from the story later on, but this is the brief moment in which Elendil had an uncle, Elentir. Elentir, the brother of Amandil, loved her, but when first she saw Pharazôn, her eyes and her heart were turned to him, for his beauty and for his wealth also. But he went away, and she remained unwed. And now it came to pass that her father Tar-Palantir grew weary of grief and died. And as he had no son, the scepter came to her in the name of Tar-Muriel, by right, and the laws of the Numenorians. But Pharazôn arose, remember this is a very sketchy handwritten draft, and came to her, and she was glad, and forsook the allegiance of her father for the time, being enamoured of Pharazôn. And in this they broke the laws of Numenor that forbade marriage even in the royal house between those more nearly akin than cousins in the second degree. But they were too powerful for any to gainsay them. And when they were wedded, she yielded the scepter to Pharazôn, and he sat upon the throne of Elros, in the name of our Pharazôn the Golden. But she retained also her title as hers by right, and was called Ar Zimrahil. Okay, so we see, first step of the Muriel story that I find interesting is this idea of him toying with a change to Muriel's story, in which, and the principal change is he's going to make her a collaborator. He is going to make the elevation of Tar-Pharazôn her choice and her doing, rather than her being the victim and helpless, as it were, to prevent Ar-Pharazôn from A, marrying his first cousin, and B, taking the scepter from her. He is the story instead becomes a story of her breaking with her father. Muriel herself falls here. Anyway, so this is it's a fascinating shift. One thing I would point out, although of course Muriel becomes a much less admirable character, she also becomes a stronger character. She is no longer merely the pawn of Pharazôn. One thing that he is doing is placing her as a much more central actor. And setting both of them, both Muriel and Pharazôn, up to be, I'm going to say, I'll just put a little asterisk next to the word to say it might not be wholly appropriate, but setting them both up as tragic figures. Muriel and Pharazôn both as tragic figures. Note the expansion of what we get here about Pharazôn's youth and his promise. Remember Manwë weeping for the marring of Feanor? It's like we're here being invited in what we have not been invited to do very frequently over the history of the development of the story of Numenor. We are being invited to mourn for the marring of Pharazôn. Pharazôn, what as he might have been. But instead, he went bad. And Muriel played a role in that. Muriel's own choice. Yeah, Adam, she has much greater agency in this version of the story. So that seems to be one of the most significant steps that Tolkien seems to have taken here, it seems to me, in his revising of the stories. So again, those would be basically the two things that I would point out. First, the way that he's kind of complicating Pharazôn's story. He is presented from the fall of Numenor through the downfall of Anadune and the earlier drafts of the Akallabeth. He's just presented as the last in the long line of increasingly wicked kings. The greatest and most powerful of all of the kings, but also the most wicked. And we see him here complicating that away, making Pharazôn more of a person, right? Giving him a more complicated history. And this glimpse of like, he might have been awesome. There was so much that was really admirable in him, but tragically he made bad choices. Came under the influence of bad people like his dad and made bad choices. But Muriel also. Muriel also, through her greatly increased agency, uses that agency badly. Remember also, by the way, how this is a return to the original story. If you remember way back when we discussed the fall of Numenor back in The Lost Road, Volume 4 of the History of Middle-earth, you will remember that in the original Numenorian story, the evil king had an evil queen. The last king of Numenor. The last queen was just as bad. And so Muriel's story had changed from then, but now we see it kind of going back to that. But when it returns, it's far more complex and interesting. And again, there's this element of tragedy. She has a tragic fall, Muriel does. her eyes and her heart turn away from the, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess, virtuous Elentir, brother of Amandil, Lord of Anadune, who loves her, to the wealthy, admirable, hot Pharazôn, right? And yeah, Maureen, yielded is interesting, right? When they were wedded, she yielded the scepter to Pharazôn. Yielded is a kind of a weighted word, right? On the one hand, it's exactly the opposite of him seizing the scepter from her, right? She's that word yielded is what gives her all the agency there, right? It was her choice to make Pharazôn king, to make him the ruler. He's ruler because she decided he should be, that she wanted him to be. But there's an irony in it too, right? She exerts her agency by relieving herself of her agency. So yeah, there's, but again, even there, you can see it's a more complicated story, right, than either of the other two. Yeah, well, so Arthur, I see no evidence in this paragraph to support the fact that she yielded it under pressure here. Once they marry, it's they broke the laws of Numenor. They were too powerful for any to gainsay them. When they were wedded, she yielded the scepter to Pharazôn. But she retained also her title of hers by right and was called Ar-Zimrahil. So the two of them are co-ruling, right? But she gives the scepter to him. So again, like it's possible, like we can imagine a version of the story, in which her having the scepter taken away from her by Pharazôn is still operative in the background, potentially. I mean, it is still very briefly told here. And yet, her agency is the whole theme of that second paragraph in this story. Yeah. Anyway, but now watch what happens. Because there's like 4 versions of this, right? Now watch. Now Zimrahil, whom her father called Muriel, only daughter of Tar-Palantir, was a woman of great beauty, smaller in stature, possibly, than were most women of that land, with bright eyes, and she had great skill in something or other. Remember, this is a particularly bad handwriting passage. Which means, what does that mean? Tolkien was composing at speed, right? I think that's important here. Okay, anyway, she had great skill in something or other. She was older than our Pharazôn by 1 year, but seemed younger, and his eyes and heart were turned to her. But the laws of Numenor lay between, beside the displeasure of her father, whom Gimilchad opposed in all ways that he could. For in Numenor, cousins in the first degree did not marry even in the royal house. And moreover, Zimrahil was betrothed to Elentir, Amandil's possibly older brother and heir of Numendil. Skipping a little bit. And Amandil and Pharazôn rode in Anadune, and Elentir and Zimrahil saw them afar as they possibly stood and something, for Elentir loved his brother. But when Zimrahil saw Pharazôn in the splendor of his young manhood come riding in, doing something or other, suddenly Zimrahil's heart turned towards him. And when Pharazôn was greeted upon the steps of the house, their eyes met. Something happened, and were abashed. And then Christopher comments, I take this to be a further movement in the story, struggling to emerge, in which my father was considering a different treatment of Pharazôn's intrusion into the relationship of Muriel and Elentir, who are now said to be betrothed. But the sketch is so rapid, and so much is indecipherable, that the actual course of the story is obscure. Agreed. And I'm not going to try to make too much of the particular trajectory of the story. Except for the parts that I am. So let me confess. So I'm trying not to lean on the details, especially the stuff that he's guessing about. But let's take a few steps back from here. Okay. First of all, notice how the register is changing in this story. Do you notice that? Think of the version in the Akallabeth, the 1-paragraph version. No, the 2-sentence. How much prose does Muriel get? She gets 2 sentences in the Akallabeth, right? 2 sentences to acknowledge that she ought to have been queen, but the scepter was seized and she was married by force, and then she gets sidelined by Pharazôn, and then we forget about her until she is drowned at the end, which is awesome. I agree. But in any case, like it's that brief of a story. But look at this. A woman of great beauty, smaller in stature than were most women of that land, with bright eyes, and she had great, whatever it was, she had great skill in, right? Think of this kind of detail that we're getting. Again, this is a character that's emerging. This is a person now. She was older than our Pharazôn by 1 year, but seemed younger. I mean, this is a fundamentally different kind of narrative. And notice this, we're getting this turning point. Like, it's hard to follow the exact details of what's going on when Elentir and Zimrahil are walking together. Remember, they're betrothed together. So you've got the two like fiancés walking together, and they see Amandil, Elentir's younger brother, and his good buddy Pharazôn come riding in together. And this is like the fateful moment when she looks upon Pharazôn, and he looks so hot on his horse right now, and her heart is moved. Her heart turns towards him. I mean, goodness, like, again, given how brief the treatment of Muriel's character is in the version of the Akallabeth that he's probably already written. I say probably because Christopher's not 100% sure of the chronological relationship of these different drafts, but he thinks this is later than the other. Anyway, think how different. I mean, this is a moment. Do you see how this is? It's not just that the story is changing in details. It's becoming a completely different kind of story. And in fact, here's my second point about this. I think I know what story it's becoming. Or rather, I will say, doesn't this start to sound hauntingly familiar? Yes, a morally gray romantic story. Does that ring any bells for anybody? Anybody else suddenly thinking about another story here? A story that Tolkien actually did write? Notice, when now we're suddenly getting this comparative wealth of detail about Muriel, notice that the first thing that's commented, first thing is that she has great beauty. The second thing that's commented is that she's short. Shorter than most of the women of that land. And her eyes are bright. And she's skilled in some sort of craft. Does that sound like anybody we know? Really hot Numenorian woman, but shorter in stature, and therefore, by implication, possibly of mixed blood? And she has definite plans for her life, but then she sees the young princely figure riding in, and her heart turns to him, and she's swept away, even though he has been away. It's Eldarion and Erendis. That's Erendis. Erendis, the Numenorian character, yes, the mariner's wife. In the one Numenorian story that Tolkien did in fact go on to write, and he's going to write it later. He's going to write Eldarion and Erendis in like 5 years after this. But I think we can see the template's already there. Like, this story is growing in his head. The fraught romance, tragic in the sense of like stubbornly gone through, though it really wasn't a good idea, right? Muriel she is like the foreshadowing, right? She's the rough draft of Erendis and Pharazôn of Eldarion. You see it? It was, I'd never noticed it until like that smaller than most women of that land thing hit me in the face this time. And I was like, oh my goodness, it's horrendous. But more importantly, so it's not just that we can see here in the story that he's beginning to tell of Muriel and Pharazôn, the first steps to what I think is eventually going to grow into the story of Eldarion and Emergence. That's not, I mean, that's kind of fun, but that's not the main point. My main point is that he, that is really interesting, Arthur. Arthur and Adam were both thinking of the children of Hurin. He is at the same time also, right now, that he's writing that incest story. A little bit different than the cousins thing, but still, like, that's kind of on the brain. Anyway, here's the point that I'm trying to make here. It is interesting that he is in these extrapolations, in these side notes, these really rapidly drawn, like this stuff is just flying out of his head and he's trying to catch it badly with his worst handwriting, right? Meaning he's composing at great speed here. This story is just coming out as he's trying to write the Akallabeth, which is meant to be short. 2 sentences on Muriel is what is supposed to happen in the Akallabeth. And instead, while he's trying to write the 2 sentences on Muriel. And while writing those 2 sentences, he considers, maybe I changed those 2 sentences. What would those changed 2 sentences look like? Oh, I know what those changed 2 sentences would look like. They would look like a 50-page story, actually. And that's what he starts writing. And you can see it coming. You can see it coming. This fragment, if you told the full version of this story in the register that he's telling here in this fragment, it would be long. It would be longer than the whole Akallabeth. In other words, as he's writing this, an entirely different story in an entirely different mode and in an entirely different scope starts coming out. This is what we saw. This is what we saw. You can see this kind of thing happening in The Lord of the Rings all the time. From projected notes. That's why The Lord of the Rings ended up being so long. Much longer than he thought it was. Remember when he thought he was halfway done? When he got to Rivendell? And of course, we've seen this happen in some other places as well. To me, that was the most exciting drama about the Numenorian stuff as he's trying to prep this. You can see it trying to peek out. Now, watch what happens when we get to the Tale of Years. This thing keeps happening. So here's his initial notes about the time scheme. He's going to do some math. Time scheme. Ages last about 300 years. This is just like his plot summary, his story foreseen from this point notes, remember, that he used to do when he was writing The Lord of the Rings? Those were always so much fun. The Tale of Years starts like that. Spiritual era, so like yes and no on Here Coming the Math. This, on the one hand, he is doing math, right? On the other hand, this is not him doing elf growth cycles math. Watch. I'll try to show you what I mean. Here's my main point. My main point about the development of the Second Age Tale of Years. This whole chapter. Here's my primary take home from this whole chapter. Watch what happens to the narrative register of his. Forget the math. Many of you will be delighted to hear me say that. Forget the math. Forget the numbers. Forget the years. When I read this chapter, it's not true that I don't care at all, but I'm very little interested in exactly which numbers and dates he ended up putting down. But what I am fascinated by is watch what happens to the Numenor story through this process. So here's where we begin. Ages last about 3,000 years. The Black Years, or the age, which is what he calls the whole Second Age here. The Black Years, or the age between the Great Battle and the defeat of Morgoth and the fall of Numenor and the overthrow of Sauron, lasted about 3,500 years. Thus, Great Battle, Judgment of Fionwe, and Establishment of Numenor, year 10. So that took 10 years. From the end of the War of Wrath, right? Overthrow of Morgoth. Through to establishment of Numenor, time to get on the boats. 10 years. Reign of Elros, 410 years. 11 other kings averaging 240 years each, 2640. Last 13th king, 220, 3280. Total years so far. But wait, we're not done. Elendil, very long-lived, was many rejected figures, 200 years old at fall of Numenor, and Isildur 100. The New Realms lasted 100 years before Sauron opened war. The Gathering of Alliance, 3 years. The Siege, 7 years. Total of 10. So you take the 100 years of between the arrival of Elendil in Middle-earth and the beginning of the war. And then you add the decade of the war, and that brings us up to 3390. Right? Okay, no problem. So yes, Elendil was 300 when he died. Correct. Which means tragic and sad though his death may have been, at the Battle of Dagger, on the slopes of Mount Doom, he didn't exactly die before his time. Exactly, right? So yes, he is here, and we see here Tolkien imagining Elendil as a very aged king indeed. By the time he dies, but that's not the main thing I wanted to focus. That is an interesting note. Here's another thing. So notice the role that the math plays here. He's mapping it out to make sure it will work. But I said make sure it will work. What is it? What is he trying to make work? What he's trying to make work is the concept that he has. He has a concept for how this whole Numenor, the story of the Second Age, should go. And many of the numbers, they need to work. Like the final math needs to work, but the math isn't driving it. What's driving it is like the symbolic significance. We start with the reign of Elros. And then the next kings need to have an appropriate length of reign such that clearly the other number that is really important to him. So the number 410 is important. That is like he wants Elros to reign for a really long time. His span of kingship should be well beyond not only other Numenorians, but everybody, right? That's mythically important for him in the establishment of Numenor. And that the last king should be the 13th is clear, right? Clearly important to him. And that's the math that he's doing. What does that get us? 11 other kings at 240 each. And so clearly he's tweaking these numbers. Why does he reject so many numbers before he settles on 200 years old at the fall of Numenor? Because he wants to make it all work. Anyway, okay. So he's doing math to make sure that it holds together. But he has his concepts that are driving it. But this is all pretty sketchy. Notice how little is here. Right? I mean, there's literally 3 events in the Black Years, in the Second Age. The establishment of Numenor and his subsequent reign of Elros. Right? The establishment of the reign of Elros. That's one event. There's the fall of Numenor, which is the second event. after a bunch of other kings who we don't care about very much, apparently. And then the Last Alliance. Those are the three things. That's the Second Age, right? Those three things are the Second Age. Okay. Now watch what he keeps doing. This was fun. The Third Age was drawing to its end in Frodo's time. So that loss of ring was about 3,000 years ago. For 500 years, Sauron remained quiet and then began slowly to grow in Mirkwood. That stirred events and wakened the ring to come back. So, Smeagol and Diegol's finding occurred about 600 years after Isildur's death. Gollum, therefore, had the ring nearly 2,400 years. Notice that by chance, that is 10 times as long as the reign of a Numenorian king. And notice, remember, these are just notes Tolkien is scribbling. He transitions right from a note about Gollum having the ring for 2,400 years to like, oh wait, what was the average life of a Numenorian? 210 years. 3 times 70. 70, right? That's the average human, the traditional human life expectancy. 70 years, 10. That's in the Bible. That the years of their life shall be 10. So 210 years. Average life of a royal house, 350 years. A king of Numenor usually exceeded when about 100 to 120 and ruled about 250 years. Yeah, Adam, he would be Gollum the Great, in fact. Ruling 10 times as long as a Numenorian king. But I don't want to read too much into it because you never know about these notes, these handwritten notes that Tolkien wrote, right? And this is clearly scribble, right? I mean, like, we can't prove that he didn't write that first paragraph one day, then like set it aside, go take care of Edith, do things at college and everything, and then come back 3 months later and write the next line about the average life of a Numenorian. Like, that's possible. But if that didn't happen, if he did write this all at one time, which Christopher doesn't tell us, there's evidence to suggest that there was a lapse of time, like a different pen nib or something like that. Christopher usually talks about that sort of thing. If he did write this all at one time, it does suggest that his writing about Gollum's extreme old age did immediately drive him back to thinking about Numenorian ages. It will be seen that the dates of events in the Second Age are for the most part at variance with those in Appendix B, in many cases very widely so. Thus, Imladris was founded at the same time as Eregion in 750, but in Appendix B not until 1697, in the War of the Elves at Sauron, when Eregion was laid waste. Yes, isn't it interesting that in the original conception, Imladris is established in peace early on, at the same time that Eregion is established. It later on gets involved in the war with Sauron, but it's not founded for that reason. So that was a fundamental shift in the idea of the in the establishment there. Yeah. Anyway, okay. Right. The most extreme of these differences refers, in fact, to the Third Age, in the headnote to the text, where the statement in TA that Diegol found the ring in about Third Age 1100 and therefore Gollum possessed it for some 1900 years, he's changed that a little bit, is repeated. In Appendix B, Diegol finds the ring in Third Age 2463, by which reckoning Gollum had it for 478 years until Bilbo found it in 2941. So again, here's Christopher talking about the fact that Tolkien changed his mind significantly between what is finally published in Appendix B and what is here in this draft. That this idea of the ring being found very, very early on is part of. So and again, the thing that is so fascinating to me is that on the one hand, you could say, well, yeah, he's thinking about all this second and third age. Christopher's separation of the third age, Tale of Years, and the second age, Tale of Years, is an artificial divide, right? Tolkien's thinking all of these dates together, really. And that's certainly fair enough. But it is interesting to me that Gollum's possession of the ring seems to be almost part of the Numenorian story in some sense in Tolkien's mind, the way he's doing his transitions. It's so interesting. Two other points of this earliest version, or strictly versions, of the Tale of Years of the Second Age remains to be mentioned. The loss of the One Ring is expressly placed in the last year of the Second Age, 3441. Whereas in Appendix B, the headnote states that the age ended with the first overthrow of Sauron and the taking of the One Ring. Cross-reference also the last words of Section 1 of Appendix A. Anyway, while planting the White Tree in Minas Anor, the handing over of the South Kingdom to Melendil and the death of Isildur are placed at year 2 of the Third Age. Secondly, in the entry for 3319, Anarion is placed before Isildur, and it will be seen shortly that this does indeed mean that Anarion was the elder of Elendil's sons. Thinking all the way from the Fall of Numenor 3, his sons Anarion and Isildur. In Akallabeth A, and subsequently, Isildur had 4 ships and Anarion 2, from which it seems clear that the reversal of this had already taken place. On the other hand, in an early version of the chapter The Council of Elrond, Isildur was expressly stated to be the elder. Okay, so we have him toying with the idea of Isildur actually being the younger son is one point that Christopher is making here. But notice that he's also, one of the big picture, the sort of the brief take-homes I want to take from this is the fact that Tolkien is toying with the question of what it means for the age to end. How do you define when the ages end or begin? What is year 1 of the Third Age? Is it the year of, does this Third Age begin on the day that Sauron was overthrown? Or does it begin on, as this suggested, the day that the One Ring was lost by Isildur? What is it that defines the age? So now, again, we know where he's going to end up on this. He's going to decide upon the rule, essentially, that the age always ends with the overthrow of the big bad. Morgoth is overthrown. That's the first day of the Second Age. Sauron is overthrown on Barad-dûr. Overthrow, that's the end of the second, right? That's the first day of the Third Age. The ring is unmade and Barad-dûr falls and Sauron is cast down forever. That's the first day of the Fourth Age. But he wasn't totally and automatically there. And he was thinking of using the ring itself as a definition, which is interesting. More. Okay. Every explanation of this extraordinary textual puzzle seems to founder. Oh, so I'm not going to talk about this too much. This is a really interesting. So this is where Christopher is talking about all of the changing numbers that I'm not paying all that much attention to. And the shifting of dates and the fiddling with the dates in the Second Age list that Tolkien is making from one draft to another. But I just wanted to make sure you caught this interesting thing that Christopher suggests here. So the extraordinary textual puzzle is like why he's changing the numbers and on what basis and what the heck is going on there. And which one comes before and which ones come before and which ones are after and all that thing. It is not in itself perhaps a matter of great significance, though one certainly gets the impression that there is more to the date 3319 and possibly also to 3441 than the evidence reveals. It is clear at any rate that all these texts, the original manuscript of the Akallabeth and its associated scheme, the computations in the texts TA and TB, and the initial version of the Tale of Years, arose at the same time, before the narrative of the Lord of the Rings was in final form, while the evidence suggests that it was these computations of the Numenorian kings, formulaic as they were, that provided the chronological vehicle of the Second Age established at that time. So he's still working on the Lord of the Rings while he's trying to sort this stuff out. The intriguing theory that I just wanted to note, there was all this fiddling of numbers. Why does Tolkien care so much? And Christopher's suggestion here, he says he doesn't claim to understand it, and he doesn't claim to think it's necessarily really important. But what he's pointing out is the reason Tolkien kept going back and altering the numbers and altering the numbers and all, he wouldn't have had to do that if he had just shifted the final date. 3319 is the date of the downfall of Numenor. And Tolkien sticks to that. So as the story changes, that's why he changes everything all the time. Because as the story changes, the events on the way from Elros to Ar-Pharazôn change, he has to keep monkeying with the numbers. Why? Because he insists on keeping the end date. If he were flexible about the end, it'd be fine. He could just squeeze in an extra century here or there, no problem. He wouldn't have to go back and recalibrate everything every time. But he does because he wants it all to keep ending at 3319 for some reason. And possibly also 3441. Well, that was the loss of the ring, wasn't it? In the midst of all of his tinkering with the numbers, for whatever reason, that one number, 3319, that the downfall of Numenor should happen in year 3319 of the Second Age, seems to be some kind of like absolute that he held to. And I love the way Christopher says this. One gets the impression that there is more to the date 3319 than the evidence reveals. He's like, I don't know why that number was important to him. Why he didn't just bump it instead of changing everything else. Retweaking everything every time to make it come out to 3319, no matter how many kings there were, right? But that's what he kept doing. And that's, I don't know the answer to that either, but I think that is a really interesting observation. Speaking of really interesting observations, here's one that comes out of nowhere. Year 50, Foundation of Numenor, added. About the same time, the works of Moria begun by Durin the Dwarf and his folk from the ruins of the ancient dwarf cities in the Blue Mountains. What? Khazad-dûm starts at year 50 of the Second Age? Built by refugees from Nógrad and Belagast? Whoa. Wild. But he crosses it out and says, about this time, many dwarves fleeing from the ruins of the dwarf cities in the Blue Mountains came to Moria, and its power and the splendor of its works were greatly increased. I could, when I was reading this, I couldn't help but think of the Rings of Power. There are two reasons, I think, why there seem two clear explanations for why Tolkien had this impulse. One is continuity, right? He's got Moria, Khazad-dûm, squarely there in the Third Age, right? It's part of the Lord of the Rings story. And glimpses of its history, though only brief glimpses of its history. And then you've got Nógrad and Belagast from the Silmarillion stuff. And so he wants to create some continuity in between them. And so he defines a link. Remember the reference to Khazad-dûm in the published Silmarillion? That's a much later edition. That doesn't exist yet. It's just Nógrad and Belagast. So one thing he does is establish some kind of continuity. But I think that there's another emphasis. And the other emphasis is the parallel. I think it's no coincidence. It's not just that he said, oh yeah, right around the beginning of the Second Age, let's have Moria start then. It's not just that. And yes, Eric, I agree. A lot of the Second Age stuff feels like, how do I get from my old stories to my new story? How do I build those connectors across? The Second Age, in large part, is a kind of connector between the First and Third Ages, right? But it isn't just that. Why does he choose year 50? Why does he choose the very year of the foundation of Numenor and say it's also the foundation of Moria? Because of the obvious parallels between Numenor and Moria, Adam, exactly. The same parallels between Numenor and Moria, which the Rings of Power showrunners couldn't resist either, right? And I think it's, so many people have been outraged. I haven't loved it, as I've said myself many times, but a lot of people have hated the fact that the fall of Khazad-dûm is being pulled into the Second Age by the TV show, because they want to do the fall of Moria and the fall of Khazad-dûm in parallel. Here we learn that Tolkien wasn't going to move the fall of Moria back into the Second Age in order to establish that parallel. Instead, he was going to move the origin of Moria up to the Second Age to have it co-founded with Numenor at the same time in order to establish that parallel. It's, in its way, it is no less violent a change. In some ways, it's a more profound change. Because, like, what happened to the, drinking from yet untasted wells if Durin the Dwarf isn't founding Moria until year 50 of the Second Age, right? That's a pretty big change, really. And in his defense, he immediately kicks it, right? But still, it's that he even briefly had that impulse shows. I think that Tolkien felt the same resonance between the Moria story and the Numenor story that the Rings of Power showrunners feel, right? I couldn't help but notice that. Anyway, okay. Watch what's starting. I know we're late. I'll stop in just a minute, but okay, a couple minutes. Not many minutes more, I promise. But I wanted to get to the end of this trend. Watch what's happening. Here's a later version of the Tale of Years. Remember where we started? Let's just do a quick, brief thing. We started here. Great battle. Judgment of Fionwe and establishment of Numenor. Reign of Elros. Last 13th king. That's where we started. And now here we are. 3320. Foundation of the realm of Arnor in the north of the Westlands, with the city of Annúminas, and of Gondor about the waters of Anduin in the south, with the city Osgiliath. The stones are divided. Elendil retains 3 in the North Kingdom, at Annúminas and on Amansul, and in the Tower of Emin-Bereid, the Tower Hills. His sons take 4, and set them at Minas Ithil and Minas Anor, at Osgiliath and at Orthanc. In the same year, Sauron returns to Middle-earth, and being at first filled with fear by the power and wrath of the Lords of the West, he hides himself in Mordor and is quiet. 34:30-3. Sauron, being at last ready again, makes war upon Gondor. Orodruin bursts into smoke and flame, and men of Gondor, seeing the sign, rename it Amon Amarth, Mount Doom. Sauron comes forth and assails Minas Ithil, and destroys the white tree that Isildur planted there. Isildur takes a seedling of the tree, and escapes by ship down Anduin with his wife and sons. He sails to Elendil in the north. The last alliance is formed between Gil-galad, Elven King, and Elendil and his sons. They march east to Imladris, summoning all folk to their aid. See what's happening? He started, and Eric, there's no question, as you suggested, the Second Age stuff is very clearly a connector, right? A bridge. Like a single narrow span connecting over a chasm, right? Connecting the First Age and the Third Age. But But notice what's happening. It's becoming a story. Notice how his narrative is becoming narrative. And remember, this has happened before. What is the Silmarillion? How did the Silmarillion come to be? How did version 1 of the Silmarillion come to be? Not version way 1, sorry. How did the Quenta Silmarillion come to be? It started as a plot summary. And he summarizes the plot. And as he's summarizing it, he starts building it out. And he adapts this whole plot summary genre thing, right? And then what does he do? Then in order to get everything clear in his head, he wants to make a chronology. So he does. The Tale of Years for the First Age. Remember the Tale of Years for the First Age? It's not included in the appendices for very good reason. Because it becomes the Annals of Beleriand and the Annals of Aman, and then the Grey Annals, and the Annals of Beleriand. I always forget which. There's the Grey Annals were the second ones. And whatever. You know what I'm talking about. All the annals, right? Horatio, he absolutely cannot help himself once he gets going. But what I would add to that, writing chronologies is one of the things that gets him going. When he starts mapping things out, the story begins to unfold. And as we look at these drafts of the Tale of Years, we see the story unfolding powerfully. Right? Dialogue between characters is one of the ways in which his world expands and he discovers things. Chronologies. For decades, chronologies have been one of the things that has sparked his story understanding. So again, the project that began for Tolkien as I'm just going to write out a neat chronology so I can keep everything straight for the story of the Quenta Silmarillion grew until it became a parallel Quenta. So now you have the Quenta Silmarillion and you have the Annals telling the same story in parallel. Because the Annals totally grew out of control. Just like this. Because as he wrote it out in neat chronological form, he discovered all of these things and it became a story. And that is absolutely happening with the Second Age here. So notice these two separate examples that we've seen of Numenor stories, Second Age stories, just starting to sprout. The Muriel stuff, where the proto-Aldarian and Arendis story threatens to break out, attempts to break out. And now, the new Annals of Gondor, or whatever, right? The Annals of Numenor are threatening to break out and become the next sort of Quenta Silmarillion, like Quenta, Numenore or whatever. This is what I was referring to at the beginning. You can see this stuff happening. You can see that as he's digging into this stuff, and by the time he's gotten here, remember the time, you can tell from all the references to the Palantiri. That's why I quoted this part. We know exactly where we are. He's written the Lord of the Rings now, right? The Lord of the Rings is done. Because you remember from the history of the Lord of the Rings that the Palantiri were only discovered when Wormtongue hucked one at Gandalf's head, right? When the Palantir hits the stairs and goes rolling down into a pool, Tolkien had no idea what the thing was and only figured it out afterwards. So it's obvious that he's writing this after he's written The Lord of the Rings, though presumably just after, and before the appendices have been handed in to Alan and Unwin for the Return of the King. But while he's doing that, as he is trying to whip up some appendices, the story is being unruly, and it's growing, and it's going to be a problem. In fact, in the end, I think it's going to be a tragedy. Honestly, I find it kind of sad, but for now, just notice that those two stories, the Muriel story and all of the narrative that is blooming here as he digs deeper and deeper into the chronologies. Everything is becoming more clearly. The story of Numenor is growing right in front of him. Again, what's going to happen with it? What is it going to end up? Anyway, all right. Tune in next time when we will see a little bit more about what happens with the Numenor story. We'll definitely finish this Appendix B, the Tale of Years of the Second Age chapter, and then we will begin with the Heirs of Elendil. It's a long chapter, but read the Heirs of Elendil chapter because we'll see how far we get through there. So, all right. Thank you, everybody. Don't forget, send an email to donate@signumu.org. Mention Mythgard Academy in the subject line and put your name in the main email, and we will enter you in a drawing for a space token that we will be giving away asynchronously. I'll give it away at the beginning of class on the 19th of November, 2025, and we will continue to celebrate the generosity of all of the people who help to support Signum University through our annual fund and our fall fundraising campaign. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening. Bye now.